Alrighty folks, good morning and welcome back to the Florida Railroad Museum and the Sunshine State Rails. This morning, December 2nd, 2024, I want to take y'all down the track with me again today and show you what it's like to swap out a couple of our track joint bars that can join our various rail pieces together that create our continuous track to parish. Now that it is December of the year, our North Pole Express is in full swing, and that is our top priority and biggest train of the year. So as maintenance away foreman, it's my job to make sure that every week this track is inspected end to end to make sure that everything is in good shape and that it is fit for biggest train of the year to run safely and multiple times a night back and forth. So anyhow, we've got a couple of joint bars to swap out today. This is my book of reports that I fill out every time that I clear the track each week or mark down various defects that I find. And last week I have found a couple. Two joint bars, one located at mile 8575 and the other at 8585. These two have various forms of cracking that are developing issues that need to be fixed pretty soon. And considering that the biggest train of the year is beginning to run now, we're going to get that done as quickly as possible. So we'll get that done today, and I'll take y'all along for the ride to see what that's like and what that those processes entail. So I've checked all the fluids on our various pieces to bring with us today. We've got the trusty tie crane and our supply and air compressor carts. We've checked the hydraulic, water, motor oil, etc. We're good to go. So we're going to get all our supplies loaded up, head down the track to our points of interest, and we'll catch up with you there and see what the work is ready to do. About an hour later, as I perform another rough rolling inspection on the way down, we'd make it to our first broken joint bar located on the east rail in the parish curve just south of Dickey Road. With the equipment stopped and parked, the next step would be to chock the carts that we were going to leave in place. The supply and air compressor carts are going to stay stationary north of the joint while I move the crane and flat cart out of the way so that I have room to do the work. Though since the crane is the only piece of equipment here with a manual parking brake, chocks need to be added to one of the wheels on the stationary equipment so that they do not roll away while we're trying to do our work. Well, it's a very nice day for track work. It's about 55 degrees right now. It's about 12 o'clock. Feeling pretty good. So, gonna go through a couple things with y'all about this first joint we gotta swap out. There's a couple interesting intricacies about these two areas we gotta fix today. So first one's down here at mile roughly 8585, and if you can't tell by looking around, we are in the parish curve. Now, that's kind of the whole reason I'm swapping this joint out, is specifically because it's in a curve. If y'all aren't aware, our line is fairly original. Most of this rail is the originally laid 1903 75-pound Dudley rail. And case in point, I'll show you right over here. Found one stamped 1900. I found rails stamped with dates as early as 1898 along this line. Yep, Maryland, 1900. But despite its age and the arguably worn out technology, it was built for 60-mile-an-hour passenger trains. So this curve may be hard to tell, but it is banked. So the elevation of the track basically does this as you go through the curve. And that would be to equalize the forces as the train moved outward like this. The curve came in like this to equalize the weight distribution over the track. That doesn't do us much good as we run 15-mile-an-hour top speed, 10-mile-an-hour in these curves. So when you take a look on the inside rail, we have a joint bar with a crack 3/4 of the way down, or 1/4 of the way down, whichever way you're looking at it. The FRA, or Federal Railroad Administration, states in Part 213.121 that if a joint bar is cracked or broken between the middle two bolt holes, it shall be replaced. So in essence, if it is broken in the middle, it is a no doubt about it must be replaced, because effectively these two bars are holding this rail to that rail in alignment and otherwise. So if you have a break between those middle two bolt holes, you effectively only have one bar holding those two rails together. Now, in this case, we have one at a quarter point, and that's why I personally call these quarter fractures. Now, these are technically legal. These do not have to be replaced, and as the sun heats these rails up and they cool down, they're effectively shifting very slightly back and forth all the time. So they're constantly putting stress on both the bolts and the bars. So over time, those bars will simply break. And if they ever break in the middle, they gotta go. But at a quarter point, they're okay. However, as I was saying, because this curve is banked, you effectively are leaning inward like this as you go around the curve in either direction. Now, that would be great if we were still running 60 mile an hour, because then the weight would be pushing this way and even it out. But running at 10 miles an hour, this is effectively what I call the weight-bearing side of the curve, because if the track is constantly doing this and you're not running fast enough to equalize that force, you're constantly putting more weight on this outside rail. So as a result of this brake being on the weight-bearing side of the rail, we're gonna swap this one out because we've got excess force on this side of the track and there's a defect in one of the joints. So that's not something I'm gonna let pass, especially with these trains we got running right now. So we're gonna get to work on this one. We're gonna take these old spikes out, get the impact, take these bars off, and judging by the state of these tie plates, I'm probably gonna replace one of them too. Let's go ahead, we'll get to work on that. The concept of pulling spikes with these pry bars is a pretty simple concept of leverage, but there's a bit of an art to this too. Whenever pulling these spikes, you want to make sure that your hands are positioned pretty low on the bar while doing so, especially if pulling from the center of the gauge, because if your hands are positioned too far up the bar and a spike decides to come loose, you will very quickly drop down and crack your knuckle on that opposite rail, and that will not be a good day for you. Though luckily I've never had this happen to me personally, though I've heard stories, and I don't wish to become one of them. So with the spikes now pulled, I'd start the air compressor on the cart, which would provide the compressed air to power the impact gun, which would take the nuts off the bolts necessary to take these bars apart. Nearly 10 seconds to get that nut off that bolt is case in point as to why you need something as powerful as an impact wrench for this kind of job. These components have been in their place for a quite literal hot minute, and these abrasive forces caused by such things are case in point also as to why bolts can come out of their sockets looking like this. The constant abrasive force will literally shave these bolts down and sometimes cause them to break as they're being tightened or loosened, which I've had happen to me on multiple occasions before. So that's why when doing jobs like this, I always bring new bolts to put in these joints. I will not reuse old components like that on a job like this where it's obvious to that extent that they've been worn hard and put away very wet. Got our new spikes, but before we drive those down, I'm gonna grab our 4-foot, 8.5-inch gauge bar. This is for checking your gauge, making sure your rails are properly spaced apart. So before we drive the spikes back in, to hold this gauge, we want to make sure it's right. Should drop right in there. Pretty good. You want to make sure that since we've been taking stuff apart and
throwing stuff around that the gauge hasn't come too far in or out. If it did, we have a special bar back on there that we can use to adjust the gauge of the rails. We'll check it a little further to make sure. Yeah, drops right down in there, so that's about perfect. So we'll keep that as is. We'll drive these in and should be on our way to the next one.
As I drive these few spikes down, a small consideration about railroad spikes that some may not realize. While some and many may believe and tell you that spikes are there to hold the track down, that isn't strictly true. The primary function of railroad spikes is to hold that gauge or spacing between the rails. So more importantly than holding the rails down, which they do pretty well on their own considering they weigh over 70 pounds a yard, the spikes more accurately are like pins held by tension in the wood that keep the rails from moving side to side and holding the gauge in place. That's why we always check said gauge before putting spikes in, because once they're down, the rails aren't moving again.
Alright, so a quick overview of what we got done here. Joint has been replaced. No defects in these new bars. All new nuts and bolts. I kept the lock washers because they're doing good, but everything else I swapped out, including that tie plate. So take a look at the spikes, and once again, this doesn't, there's no magic formula to this, so this doesn't exactly follow what I discussed before, because there's only so much that you can make work with these joints sometimes. So, like here, I've only managed to get one spike on the inside for each tie, with two on the outside here. This spike on the outer side that's not holding the joint of the rail, it's called your anchor spike. That keeps the tie plate from moving back and forth. So these are basically your aligners that keep the rail centered on the plate. And while they should hold the plate as well, when you get one of these joint plates, it don't hurt to put an anchor in there. It just makes it that much more secure. And like I said, I could have busted out the jackhammer for this, but the spike maul does plenty. Of course, there's an art to being able to drive these spikes in with a hammer of this size and shape. And I'm still not perfect at it. I'm still missing very often. But over time, that skill will be refined and improved upon. But for the time being, I'm good enough to get the job done, so I can check this off and we're gonna move on to the next one. But first, I wanna show you why these bolts are alternated in direction. Why is there one facing that way and the next facing the other, and so on? So real quick, let's show you why. So here I've got two bolts, one with a nut on the end and one without, to show you one of these more modern joint bars. They're more defined on these, but these use the same principle. So you may notice, it may be hard to tell looking at it, but you've got a circle, an elongated circle, circle, elongated. So why is that? Well, here's the thing. You stick a bolt through one of these, right? Great. You put a nut on the other side as you saw me doing. All right, assume there's an impact gun on the end of this. This is your socket. Put it on the end of that bolt, go to tighten it. What happens? The whole bolt spins. The bolt needs to stay stationary while the nut spins. Otherwise, you're not tightening it. You're just spinning the whole thing. You're not doing anything. So, how are you going to keep this bolt from turning while the nut can free spin? Well, that's what these are for. These elongated holes are for these little rings on the end of the bolt right underneath the head. These are called the oval necks. The oval neck of the bolt is what goes into these elongated holes. See, as it goes in, so when it's in that hole, it keeps the bolt from being able to spin back and forth. So then this way, you've got one with just a hole where the bolt comes through on that side, and that doesn't give it as much room to move around. Now, do they need to be alternated? That I'm not entirely sure of. Theoretically, you could have all three oval holes and have all the bolts facing the same way to complete the same principle. I think the Webers actually work similar in that way. If you take a look at a lot of the Webers, the bolts are all facing the same way. That is the way it is. When you take one of these apart, you see the oval, hole, and you want to have these alternated so that on the other side, your joint bars are gonna line up. So you've got an oval going through to a regular hole. So that you get the threaded side through the regular hole. You get the idea. That keeps your bolts from free spinning and you're able to tighten your nuts. So, pretty simple concept, I think, but it's pretty neat. Like all this, little intricate things that you don't think about too often, but are very important factors in how these mechanical intricacies work. So, we're gonna load this up and got another joint bar to go do, so let's get to it. All right, here we are now at our next joint bar. We're actually closer to a mile, roughly SW8578. We're just north of Dickey Road. And here we are with a classic Weber joint. As I said, there's a bit of interesting bits about these joints we get to do. And the second one is one of the aforementioned Webers. I did a video in the past on track work that discussed these in detail, but I'll try to go through it lightly again as we do this. But these joint bars were basically the prehistoric versions of the modern day joint bars. This was the alternative before the lock washer was invented. So the lock washers basically put outward force on the nuts, so they're constantly under stress. That keeps them from wanting to back out via vibrations and trains going over and all that fun stuff. But before they were invented, the Weber joint accomplished the same thing. Instead of lock washers, they used a block of wood. Now granted, these bolts have obviously been replaced because the original Weber would not have had lock washers on these bolts, and these now do. So these have obviously been preventative maintenance measures taken at some point to keep these bolts from backing out, because I'm constantly tightening bolts. A lot of track work is just tightening nuts on these bolts for certain joint bars because they naturally come loose, even with the lock washers over time. But the Webers that still don't have these are notorious for coming loose because the wood is degrading and rotting, and it's not doing the same thing as it used to. As you can see, the whole frame has been bent in, and effectively the wood would create that cushiony effect and kind of push the nuts out. Definitely not with the same effectiveness as the lock washers, but that was the alternative before they were invented. Now, as I've been rambling on here, you may have already found the problem with this joint bar. The big no-no. That's a break right down the middle. Now, granted, this is kind of an odd, I feel like I've been saying that all day, but this really is an odd example here because the Webers are made up of 3 pieces. Because this bar that you see on the outside actually has a plate that goes underneath the rail, and that's actually what's broken right there. So that piece is actually part of that whole plate, which is supposed to be solid like this is, but it's breaking everywhere. And as the title of this video suggests, the heat in Florida is exactly what's responsible for this. The constant movement of the metal via expansion and contraction via heat is what causes metal to break, especially with these very old components. They can break in some really interesting ways. There's another retaining plate on the back of this, which is actually that top piece. I'll try to put an icon to point it out. It's separate from the wall and basically what is a big long tie plate underneath. It doesn't look to be broken, but as I've said, these are developing issues, and I'm almost certain that if I let this go too much longer, there's going to be a problem. And I also can't see the inside of that plate, so I have no idea if it's broken underneath or not, and I'm not going to take that chance. So at the point that we're taking all this apart anyway, I'm just going to swap this whole joint for a modern joint bar with the proper components and, you know, not broken things. So you'll see all the components of these as we take it apart. I'm hoping I only have to take the spikes out for this tie, because it looks like that I might get lucky with that one. Which is the other interesting part about the Weber joints, is that they don't get tie plates underneath the joint, because that whole plate underneath is your tie plate, basically. But when we replace it, we're gonna have to put a tie plate underneath here, and this rail also looks to be floating a bit right there, so that actually will help us get that new tie plate under there. But enough talking, let's get to do this.
once I got all the old bolts out from between the rails, I'd be able to take all of the components of the Weber apart. First would be the inside bar. This is pretty much a typical joint bar like any other, specifically designed for the Webers. Secondly, we have the big wall and plate that is effectively your tie plate, like I mentioned before. This was the piece that was broken all over the place, but basically is the wall that covers up the piece of pine wood that is stuck inside of the outside retaining plate that I just pointed out to you with the little red arrow. This was the bit that I wasn't sure about the structural integrity of, but luckily there was no physical damage visible to this component at all. Although I can't reuse this part in the new joint because it wasn't designed with the oval openings like we discussed, and it's specifically designed only for the Webers to hold that piece of wood. The very first bar, however, I can reuse on the inside as it was designed with all oval openings, hence why all of the bolts were facing outward and in the same direction like we discussed before. For the outside, I'd just get another modern joint bar to put over it, and this would allow me to alternate the bolts as needed.
Alright, got this one back together, or repaired. Quite often in other places, I find myself driving spikes back into old holes in the ties. Now, that's okay. Now, for example, like these, if that was somewhere else where there was already a tie plate, chances are they're going to line up almost the same when I put that tie plate back under, and I may have to put a spike back in a former hole. Now, that's not going to give you the same tensile strength to hold the track down, but as we talked about before, it's still better to do that than to not, because the primary function of spikes is to keep the track from doing this. So as long as there's something in there, it's basically a pin in a hole that keeps it from doing that. So either way, it's better to do. But what's nice here, because there was no tie plate here, the spikes were just driven in at random spots to hold the rail down. But because we got a modern joint now, we're going to put this plate under, and those holes are going to basically line up to very different points, so we're basically going to be able to drive spikes into new places. So I'm going to do that real quick. We'll see how that lines up. Now, another thing to consider when you're doing tie plates for this kind of stuff, whether you're replacing ties or replacing a joint or anything of the sort, the tie plates have these lips on the edge. The rail's supposed to sit in here and line right up to that lip. You don't want this lip to ever be underneath the plate flat bottom of the rail, because that'll put excess force on this very fine point, and with the heavy weight going over this, you'll break the rail doing that. So that's something you got to watch for. But with these joints, it can be kind of misleading, because the lip here can actually go up underneath these joint bars. There's a small gap right under this excess lip where these lips can fit into, and that would be appropriate in the case of trying to line these holes up with notches like these. Again, it's all situational. You got to look at every scenario and see what's going to fit the best, what's going to hold the gauge the best, and you kind of go from there. But whether the lip can be on the outside or underneath the first part of the joint, either way will work, whichever way you can get it. That's why they have these holes on the outside. Sometimes, if these line up and this goes under, this outer hole where we put the anchor spike will be the only one that you can reach on the outside. Likewise for the inside. If this doesn't go up under here, this may be the only hole you can access because it's not able to go far enough for you to reach these. So we'll see what we can do here. See how this lines up. Let's see. Push up on that. At least get it part of the way in there. Look at them all. Don't trust what they tell you, size matters. In this case, you've got this hole here and the outer anchor hole on the inside. I don't like how that's lining up right now because I can't put a spike here because you've got this bolt in the way. I could put one here and here, but neither of these will hold this rail. And even this one will be very tight. If I can get this under the lip here, I can put one in here which will hold the rail here, and I'll have two accessible holes on the inside once the rest of those move. So I'm gonna try and get that tie plate in under that lip. But
Although, try it as I may, the various leverage tricks that I tried to get the rail to lift up did not quite work for me, so after a little bit of brainstorming, I referred once again to brute force. As I say, we are well familiar with that. Let's do it.
so now what I'll do is do that. Just like that. So I didn't have a good means of picking up on the rail here. Everything I tried leverage-wise didn't work for me, so just used brute force once again. Brought it down, lined up, and then knocked it back under there. So now, as you can see, the rail is lined up perfectly with the edge of the lip, and the lip is also underneath the edge of the joint. Maybe hard to tell, but actually I now have 3 accessible spots on the inside, and these 2 on the outside. So I'm gonna put 3 on this one. Well, first, before we decide how we're gonna do the spikes, let's check the gauge again. Then take our gauge bar, make sure we are, oh wow, look at that. So there, now that we're not sliding in there, the gauge is tight. So what we're gonna have to do now, before we put any spikes in, we're gonna have to push these rails apart. So I'll show you how we do that. Here we are. This is basically a self-binding ratchet. I call it the spreader bar. Maybe it's got a fancy name. We're not here for fancy names. We're here to get shit done. So, a little wide now. So we're gonna bring it in. Got the teeth on the end of it that you put up underneath the lip of the rail head. Once they're under there, you switch direction. And you crank it. The rails out, and now you'll watch that edge there. You push it until it slips in, give it a little bit of adjusting room, and that's good. So now that the gauge is correct, we're gonna put the spikes in while this is in there. If you just correct the gauge and then take it out, it's just gonna go right back to the incorrect way it was. So spikes need to go in while this is keeping the rails out. That may be obvious to some of you, but sometimes it has to be said. So also, now that that is done, that helps me decide how I'm gonna do the spikes right here. So because the gauge was tight, I'm gonna do 2 spikes on the inside of the gauge. So that will keep the rails from coming back in to where they were. Having 2 points of resistance here will keep it from getting tight again. And I'll just put one on the outside because, I mean, you need another one, but we're not really holding much on the outside because they want to go in. We need to keep them from doing that. So let's get that done real quick. So now we're going to take this out. And so now we'll check the gauge where we initially did. And the gauge is now correct. So now those spikes are holding that joint there. The gauge has been corrected and the joint has been fixed. That's what we got. Joint plate, 3 spikes, 2 in the gauge, 1 out. And the gauge is happy, and I'm pretty happy too. So, Florida is not one of those places where it gets cold. Sometimes cold air visits here, sometimes it stays a while. It's been staying a while for this go round, but now it's almost 2 o'clock and I'm pretty warm now. So, thanks for coming along on the track with me today, but I'm gonna get packed up and head back to the yard because I got some stuff to get done today. This is my 6th day working out here this week. Been playing elf all week in the North Pole and now playing track guy. So very good, but the work has been done. So I can go back to the yard and check off that we fixed these things and go on with our lives because the North Pole Express begins running once again tomorrow. So, but yeah, we did pretty good. So I'm gonna get packed up and head back to the yard and call it a successful day.
Well, friends, what can I tell you? 2024 has just come and gone below our noses. Now I'm filming this on December 23rd, and 22nd, last night was our last night of North Pole Express. So we just finished the event and are now starting to take it all down in preparation for next year. About as fast as we jumped from the first week on track to the last day here, for you guys in video is just about how fast it felt for me working the event, and then all of a sudden it's just gone. I mean, Christmas is in 2 days and the New Year's in just a few more. But as some may know me to say, the fun never stops. And if the opposite of fun is, well, perhaps work, and you can't have light without dark, then I guess that means the work never stops either. So that said, we're gonna have a few days off here, but it's gonna be right back to it pretty quick. So I also want to take the time here to say how extremely proud I am of our volunteers, employees, and otherwise who have supported us throughout this endeavor of what we know as Christmas and making Christmas happen for the thousands of people who ride this train every year and continue to come back and visit us every year for Christmas and all the other events that we do. We couldn't do it without our volunteers, employees, and everybody else who supports this place, including you guys, whether you donate, watch this content, or support us and promote us. Every little bit that y'all do helps us out here. So once again, we appreciate that to a greater extent than I can put into words here, but it really means the existence of this place to us that you do that. We're gonna keep doing as much as we can, but for now we stand triumphant in that Christmas season is now once again in the books for 2024. So thank y'all so much again for watching, and I wish all of y'all a very Merry Christmas and a very happy and safe New Year.